Quick time check as folks join us here. Welcome to all those joining our session. We will be getting started in a few minutes here. But as we get started, just a little bit of an icebreaker for our panelists. What is your favorite EV and why? Alex, do you want to kick us off?
Sure, I'll go first. I'll give you two. Because I represent a car or a vehicle company, of course, you have to give me one freebie. But of course, my favorite electric truck is the Ryzen truck, which I represent here today. I hope we'll get some questions about that. Of course, I'm excited about transformation to electric commercial vehicles. So the Ryzen truck is certainly near and dear to my heart. But other than that, of course, I drive an electric car as well. I drive a Tesla Model Y, not necessarily because it's the best car you can buy, but it's certainly a very, very good car if you want an electric car. It has a good range. And so far, I haven't been disappointed. So it's been okay.
Excellent. Victoria, thoughts?
So I have not made the transition yet. I'm trying to run my current car as long as I possibly can. I have my eye on the Polestar 3. I do, a little pocketbook issue potentially coming up with that, but I think, it for me, it's this really interesting mix of performance, quality, safety, reliability, and a nice design. So we'll see. I kind of look at all of them as they're coming out.
That's great. Simon?
Well, I'm going to steal a little bit from Alex's thunder there and go with two things. So one, because a lot of the projects I get to work on are with medium and heavy duty vehicles, I have had the pleasure of driving a couple of Class 8 electric tractors, which I would have never been able to do if I weren't working in this industry. And so I did get to drive an e-Cascadia, and that was pretty cool because I felt like I was on top of the world driving this massive truck. So that was neat. But from a personal vehicle perspective, for me, it has to be the Porsche Taycan. I've always been a fan of sports cars, and so I am saving my nickels and dimes, and that would be my goal is to put one of those in the garage before too long. Nice. So, Charisse, I'm really curious what you're going to say.
Yeah, absolutely. It's quite the diversity of vehicles that you all mentioned, but I'll have to go with the Ford Mustang Mach-E, based in Ann Arbor, Michigan. So kind of got to go with the big three here. Family members, work for Ford, and it's just been really a great car all around. Just the handling of it and really just the look and feel. It's interesting because we started off as a two-car family, and it feels like we're very much a one-car family because that's the only thing everybody in the family wants to drive right now. That, and it's just a really great looking vehicle as well. So yeah, that I would say has to be my favorite here.
That's awesome.
Early, if you had asked that same question 5, 7, 8 years ago, we probably would have had a lot less vehicles to choose from. So the diversity of different vehicles is also a testament of how far it's come in the last couple of years here.
Yes, absolutely. And I would have to say, Alex, it was also a pleasure to see the Ryzen vehicle being revealed at ACT Expo earlier this year as well. So yeah, very exciting time for us here. Great. Well, thanks for partaking in a little bit of an icebreaker. With that, let's go ahead and start off our session. Welcome to all those joining our session. This session is entitled Integrating Your Fleet Electrification and Infrastructure Strategies. My name is Cherie Smith, Director of EV Strategy at Edison Energy. For those unfamiliar with Edison Energy, we serve as a partner for organizations transitioning to electric vehicles or looking to deploy charging infrastructure. Our technical advisory helps clients build a case and a plan for fleet electrification, and our deep energy and utility expertise support electrification through implementation and optimization. I have the pleasure of serving as the moderator for today's session. Please note this session will be recorded. Recordings will be available 3 weeks after the event. Please use the chat box on the right side of the screen to ask any questions, engage with other attendees. I will plan to address those questions to our panelists at the end of the session. We will also have a networking break and breakout rooms for the last 15 minutes of our session as well. Final reminder, also just remember to take the survey to the right of the chat box at the conclusion of the session as well. With that, let's get into it. Today we'll be discussing the topic of developing a strategy for your fleet vehicles electrification transition, which requires understanding total cost of ownership, legislative influences, operational impacts, and other key factors. But it doesn't end there. The successful strategy must also closely be coupled with a plan for appropriate infrastructure. Our panelists will highlight best practices for creating a fleet electrification strategy and integrating it closely with infrastructure deployment considerations. I'm looking forward to an engaging session as I'm joined by some dynamic speakers today who will briefly introduce themselves and speak about their role in the electric vehicle and infrastructure transition. First, we have Victoria Emerick, Executive Director and Global Head of Corporate Sustainability Strategy and Operations at Bristol Myers Squibb. Victoria?
Hi, everybody. Thank you, Cherish. It's great to be here. I think I might represent the odd group out in where we are in terms of what our fleet looks like and how fleet electrification matters to a company like Bristol Myers, which is a 34,000 employee large biopharmaceutical company. So are we doing introductions? Should I? Okay, I'll leave it at that. Thanks.
I was going to say, yes, we're doing a round of introductions. Okay. Great. Thanks, Victoria. Second, we have Alexander Voets, General Manager at Vehicle Velocity Group. Alexander?
Yeah, hi. Thank you very much. It's great to be here. So my name is Alex Voets, even though a lot of people call me by Alex Volts now, like the electrical volts, because I've been kind of the electric guy for the last couple of years. I am the General Manager for Velocity EV. Velocity is a large dealership organization for commercial vehicles and more and more so in the last couple of years also for electric vehicles. And that's kind of my niche. Specifically, Velocity has been announced to be the distributor for the Ryzen vehicle. And Ryzen is a new class 4-5 electric commercial vehicle. The commercial vehicle industry certainly goes through a transition to electrification, especially in California, but also in other parts of the US and Canada. We see that transition. And everybody knows pretty well how to buy a truck by now, but the infrastructure is certainly something new. And that is how my organization also got in contact with Edison Energy that is helping us currently to put a number of different charging stations in at a number of our facility because customers certainly still see that as something new that they need to learn about. So I'm glad to see a lot of questions here and talk about this here as well.
Great. Thanks, Alex. Next, we have Simon Horton, Director of EV Delivery for Edison Energy. Simon.
Yeah, thanks, Cherish. Excited to be here today. So as Cherish mentioned, I am the director of our EV design and delivery team here at Edison Energy. So we work with and partner with our clients to help them implement the infrastructure necessary once they've developed a strategy and a plan to transition their fleet. And so that starts with really just assessing the facilities, understanding the needs at those facilities, and then taking a deep dive into the infrastructure and how that's going to integrate into their fleet transition. So looking forward to the discussion today.
Very good. Thanks, Simon. And with that, let's get into some questions. Wanted to dig a little bit more into where Alex and Victoria, you are all, in particular in your kind of EV journey. So perhaps starting off with Victoria, what made you or your organization decide to tackle fleet electrification and charging infrastructure here?
Absolutely. So when in 2020, when Bristol Myers, I'm responsible for developing our long-term strategic goals for sustainability. One of the areas that was very clear as I was monitoring emerging legislation, benchmarking what other companies were doing for their goals, I started to realize two things. The emerging legislation and policy around the world for countries obligating the transition to electric vehicles or zero emission vehicles. And in reading the ESG or sustainability reports to benchmark for companies, not just in my industry, but across sectors, I started to realize their commitments also included timelines for when they would stop making an internal combustion engine vehicle. So it made very good sense to us to include an EV transition target in our global goals. We only have about 7,000 vehicles max in our fleet, and they are for our commercial organization. They don't contribute to a material impact to our GHG footprint, but they do contribute to our physical or visible representation. These commercial folks are the interface for a company like mine with our external stakeholders, our healthcare providers, and just the communities in which we serve. And so this is a visible representation of the commitments that our company is making more broadly for environmental responsibility, most of which aren't always seen. If we're building in our buildings or in our products, it's a very different situation than other kind of companies.
Very good, helpful, Victoria. Really to understand policy, legislative drivers in support of that sustainability plan. Alex, I'd be interested in understanding kind of the driving factors for you and your organization.
Yeah, so for us, it was pretty easy. Velocity and Ryzen, we're there to essentially provide solutions for customers. We've been selling them trucks for a long, long time. And now with electrification, there's, of course, a new challenge to the industry. And overall, I think we're trying to go to electric powertrains for all our vehicles, right, as a society. But when you think about where you get the most bang for your buck, as far as sustainability is concerned, it certainly makes more sense to try to electrify commercial vehicles that are on the road all the time, right? They pay to be on the road. Passenger cars like you and mine, and I drive an electric car, but my car is parked most of the time. So regulations certainly have picked up on that and put a lot of regulations around electrification of the transportation industry. And that is certainly a very, very new item for all these companies. There is more stakeholders involved that traditionally had nothing to do with truck acquisition. So we're certainly see that now as our task to expand the scope and really explain to customers what's coming, how they can face these challenges with the vehicles, with the infrastructure, with the incentives, with the regulations, and ultimately educate them towards making the right decisions. We don't want to make it for them, but we certainly want to help them navigate this field that is still pretty new for everybody, but deadlines are coming hot and heavy. So we got to certainly move on these things now.
Excellent. Thank you, Alex. Yeah, very helpful to understand kind of the support that you're providing and really how you're leading in a big way during a very exciting time. As mentioned earlier, there are several challenges, when it comes to fleet electrification and charging infrastructure, including vehicle costs, total cost of ownership, organizational buy-in, utility engagement, supply chain constraints, and we certainly heard some of that in the opening session here as well. I'd be interested in understanding from your perspective, what is the single greatest challenge you've experienced, and what is one key learning or takeaway you can share? Perhaps we can start off with Simon.
Yeah, great question, Therese. There are so many different aspects to that EV transition. As Victoria and Alex highlighted, there's just the vehicle selection and how do you go about that piece and how do you integrate that? But then you've got to think about the infrastructure. How are you going to charge those vehicles? Do you have capacity to charge those vehicles at your facilities? Do you need to charge them offsite? Are these take-home vehicles? All of these different pieces that need to be factored in. The key component in all of that is buying in enough time to make that transition and finding the right partners to guide you through that piece. Because you're going to be now integrating and dealing with so many different aspects. It's the utilities for power delivery now, because now electricity is your fuel instead of conventional fuels. It's understanding the lead times for equipment, whether it's the charging equipment or the necessary equipment that's part of the infrastructure. And then it's just having the time to figure out how do we actually integrate this into our facilities. And so it's very important to not lose sight of how long it will take. There are some very short projects that can be developed in a pilot fashion or a temporary type solution to get you rolling immediately. But that long-term solution does take some time to plan out, and don't be afraid during that process of shifting gears a little bit and revamping your thoughts as you're going through that process. There's no perfect one-size-fits-all approach for everybody, but the consistent piece there is to give yourself enough time and give yourself the grace to say, I'm going to trip over a couple of things, but I found the right partners to help me get through this and get me to where I've got my fleet electrified. I've made the progression that's necessary. And don't be, like I said, don't be afraid of the challenges that are ahead of you. Just find the right partners to take you through those challenges. And it's an exciting time. You'll learn a lot as you're going through the transition. And your operations, often you'll find that you can create some operational efficiencies through the process.
Great, very helpful guidance there, Simon. Alex, Victoria, anything to add from your perspective?
I would just say everything that Simon said, obviously correct. Cost, time, education, information, all challenging. But what I would add to that is, if you have a project at your company, make sure it's somebody's job to do it, because otherwise it's everyone's job and nobody's job. And there is certainly a lot of things that need to be aligned internally in the company. There might be new stakeholders that need to sign off on something that you never used to work with. And these are high dollar amounts that will also be necessary here for even smaller deployments. So I would certainly recommend have somebody that is officially assigned and has the power and authority to move a 7-digit project through the pipeline.
Very good, very helpful, Alex. And, I think this dovetails well into the next question and a lot of what we've talked about in the past, Victoria. Understanding education is critical to key stakeholders for faster electrification and charging infrastructure deployment. What are the common misconceptions or organizational employee concerns that you have had to address in this transition, and how did you overcome?
So I think everything really does dovetail between what Simon and Alex have just said, in that, one of the biggest challenges was each site was trying to do it by, do their infrastructure by themselves, or the procurement process was thinking, well, we'll just go out and test drive vehicles and figure out which ones we need. And that's all fair. But what I did, because as Alex pointed out, my boss, myself, have the accountability for delivering this as we made it a corporate goal. And in working with Edison in particular, what we were able to do is take the time, as Simon said, take the time to plan. I'm an advocate for that, because we have a roadmap now. We have a roadmap that provides the order of events we need to do. We don't need to boil the ocean. We know where to focus. For example, Norway is a country where we have 6 or 8 vehicles in our fleet, but they also have a commitment and a goal of 2025 for the country. We have to move there first, but it's an easy move, because we've also, in the work that we've done, understood and have a comparison of the vehicles in our fleet. Is there an equal vehicle or equivalent vehicle in an electrified or zero emission form that we can make that transition easier to reduce the stress, the trust, increase the confidence of making these transitions. The other part that we did is look at not just where we have our vehicles and what's legislative changes, not just what manufacturers, but the infrastructure in the regions. We can putting charging stations at our facilities is one thing. Having charging stations in the right place that are reliable, where our vehicles are going to be used, and moving across within their regions, that was something else that got mapped out with the work from Edison. So we have this really amazing collection of strong analytics that we were able to take to our leadership. And the result of that has been where people before were like, why are we worrying about this, to we understand how to do it. So now we're willing to roll up our sleeves and put this on our list of how do we build this into our strategy. Because for us, the other component that is maybe a little unique is our fleet vehicles serve as part of our employee compensation in the cases of particularly outside the US. And how do we incorporate that into what we call our total rewards program and change the mindset from, charging stations at people's houses? What's the policy there? How do we address safety and monitor the operational aspects that Simon spoke about? But if you start with a really strong foundation of data and a broad scope of all the components that factor in, rolled into a clear, concise roadmap, it really makes it easier for an organization to understand how to build this in without the fear of what's it going to cost, or the uncertainty of, are my people going to get stuck on the side of the road? Can I get access? Because now we've got a plan that has, as Simon pointed out, time. And time is really important.
Very helpful, Victoria. Really understanding the unique challenges that installing charging infrastructure in homes versus large on-site charging depots that may be presented there. Simon, Alex, any additional thoughts on kind of the role of education in integrating that into the strategy?
I would say education is probably the most important thing. It's great to see people signing on to this here. It is very easy to get overwhelmed because there's so many new things, right? Just the fact to get your head around what kilowatts are and what kilowatt hours are and the different chargers. And some people think the charger comes with the truck or with the car, whatever else. There is a lot of learning to do. But I would say the most important advice I would give is don't wait. It is very, very easy to get overwhelmed and just say, I'll worry about this a different time. I would say get started on a small scale, go through the learnings yourself, with a small investment, and then it's much easier to scale up. A lot of people, at least in my industry, transportation electrification, will go in and will look at all their facilities and all their trucks and all their routes and then try to make decisions that way. Usually that is a very, very difficult thing to do. I always recommend start with one site, start with one location, start with your 10 best route, your 10 best drivers, and then it's much easier to scale it up from there.
And I'll just add one small comment here, circling back on what Victoria was saying about education and something that Alex mentioned earlier. Not only with the education piece, which is so key, but also finding those internal champions, and those internal champions that either are decision makers or have that straight line to decision makers, so that as you're going through this transition, you build that internal buy-in and you're not facing roadblocks all the way along.
Very good. With that, I'd be interested in transitioning a little bit here and pulling on some of the advice and guidance that you've been providing thus far, and ask whether or not, do you remember a specific experience of where you wished that you had done something differently in your vehicle electrification strategy, or if you were to do it over, what would you change and why? Alex, would you like to lead us off?
Yeah, maybe I'll tag on to my answer I just gave, which is, if I were to go back and give advice to people that I talked to a couple of years ago, is essentially exactly that advice. Don't overanalyze, don't be scared, educate yourself, start with small steps. You don't have to come out guns blazing and turn over 100 trucks tomorrow, right? Start with something that is easier to comprehend. Shameless plug for the Ryzen truck, of course. If you do have trucks, the large trucks tend to be most intimidating because they are obviously the most expensive. They take the largest amount of charging power. So we do see people that want to comply with upcoming regulations to maybe now start shifting their focus to some of the smaller vehicles where the charging solution is a little bit easier. Between AC and DC charging, the lead times can be very different. The cost for the equipment can be very different. So I would keep reiterating, start small, start with one example, start where it's the most controlled environment, and the learnings you will get are going to be so big. And all of a sudden you will be talking to a lot more people, and your ecosphere gets bigger and bigger, talking to customers, talking to providers, talking to the utility companies, and so on and so forth. And your confidence builds, the confidence in your company builds, and then it's much easier to keep that momentum going. That would be my best advice I can probably give.
Very good. Thanks, Alex. With the number of clients that you've partnered with here, Simon, anything to add there?
Well, yeah, the key is don't try and eat the entire apple in one bite. Really, this is kind of what Alex has mentioned. I think Victoria's kind of alluded to it as well. You take it in incremental steps, whether that's incremental steps in looking at your vehicle acquisitions, but certainly incremental steps when you're looking at your infrastructure. What we have discovered with a lot of the, particularly the medium and heavy duty projects that we've developed over the years, is that well thought out, scalable infrastructure is the best way to go, so that you're not overbuilding on day one and having a lot of stranded capital assets that are waiting on vehicles. But thinking about an intelligent build that allows you to scale in the future is really key. And so I think we've seen projects where they've gotten very excited and put in quite a bit of equipment at a large capital cost, and then discovered that they don't have the vehicle procurement plan that supports that much infrastructure. And so they've got capital assets that are sitting idle for a few years until the vehicles catch up. Conversely, we've seen other projects where they've taken a very narrow pilot approach and then discovered, well, these vehicles actually do work, and they have to quickly retool from a pilot to more of a, sort of phased application. So it's that developing the strategy in concert with developing the infrastructure is really key.
Very helpful, Simon. And I'll ask, I see a question or two in the chat, but if you haven't already, please feel free to add questions to the chat box. I will shift there in a moment, so please do add your questions. Last question before shifting to audience questions is, would you have a best resource that you would recommend to folks that are looking to go a little bit deeper into their kind of fleet electrification, transition strategy or deploying infrastructure? What resources would you recommend here?
Maybe I'll kick it off here. I would say certainly make a plan, like I talked about earlier. Have somebody whose job it is to drive this project forward. But that doesn't mean it's only that person's job. It's just that person drives it, right? And then get an understanding of all the things that you ultimately need information on. Is it the vehicles? Is it the infrastructure? Is it the incentives in your area? Who is your utility company? And so on and so forth. And then you can start planning out where you need to get information from. And you will realize that the sequence in which you do these might not be the same for everything you do. Sometimes you are in an area, and we have a lot of utility companies in the United States and Canada, by the way. The United States alone has about 1,100 different utility companies. So if you have more than one location, you might have more than one utility company to operate with, and they might have different processes, which will also have an impact on which site maybe to select first. So I would say you start with all these things and get some information, all these through webinars, through reports, through partners like Edison Energy on charging, through the vehicle manufacturers, ourselves and others. And then attend events, talk to other people that are in a similar situation that you are in. You will realize that a lot of people that are trying to electrify their fleet, be it on smaller cars or on larger trucks, are very willing to share. This is not a proprietary information that people give out. It is the industries trying to move through this journey together. And it's there's no losers in that game other than the ones that just don't have the information. So that's what I would probably say is the best way to attack that there.
Very good. Victoria, Simon, anything to add on best resources for those looking to go deeper on planning?
Yeah, I think it's coming from a company where this is not a driver, if you will, from a strategic driver. We are reacting to the world changing around us. We did put it into our net zero goals. I think that one of the critical parts for us is I'm responsible for all of those. I can't be everywhere to everyone, and I'm not going to. So there may be other companies on the call who are in a similar situation where we might have a spot person somewhere who knows a lot, but we've really been dependent and gratefully so on with amazing results with our partnership, in this case with Edison. But it's about finding, for us, it's been about finding a really strong partner who can help us cradle to grave through the development of the strategy. The really important, one of the things that I've learned through this process is, and the electrification of our vehicles is an unexpected, what I'll call an influencer, an unexpected change agent for helping our employees and at all levels, including our C-suite, including our board, get their minds understanding that the world is changing around us, and we have to not keep up, but we have to get ahead. It's the true definition of sustainability. And if we're installing charging stations at our sites, because we have activist employees buying EVs, they're talking to their colleagues, and then we're starting to bring them in. We're at 28% now of our fleet being either hybrid or EV. So we're starting to bring this into the conversation, and it's helping us build these change agents for our entire decarbonization strategy. And that is really important to have integrated. So we're not having a separate EV strategy from the facility decarbonization, from a renewable energy strategy, and having a partner that can help and build all that out and frankly put it into the same form of analytics. The same people get used to seeing data presented in a consistent manner at the same level of quality and reproducibility. Honestly, that has been the most invaluable thing that I've learned throughout this whole process, is tying unexpected or maybe work that doesn't always get tied together. Have that tied together in as many ways as possible, because it really is all part of the same initiative.
Excellent. Thank you, Victoria. Well said in terms of a data-driven approach, integrated in holistic strategy there. With that, I want to transition to some audience questions. Thanks for those that placed some questions in the chat. The first question that we have is, would love to know your thoughts on how private companies could incorporate into their own planning the developments that are happening at federal and state level, for example, infrastructure deployed through federal NEVI program. Thoughts, Simon? Yeah,
I'll jump on that. It's a great question. We see there's a lot of terrific incentive opportunities and grant opportunities in the market right now at a federal, at a state, sometimes at a utility or local level, at air districts and so on. And so leveraging that funding is key. You definitely don't want to turn away opportunities to get funding, but it's important to really understand that funding and understand what it does for you and what the requirements are. Not all funding is ideally applicable to all fleets. Some have very restrictive reporting requirements that may make them more onerous than the actual benefit of the funding. Others may not align with fleet operations. So that's part of that developing a really robust strategy, is understanding that incentive landscape, studying it on a regular basis, and then ensuring that the transition, whether it be vehicle funding or infrastructure funding, is really aligned with the way that you are proceeding forward. One very important key there is oftentimes the infrastructure has very strict requirements from the funding, whether it be where the equipment is sourced and some of the equipment qualifications. And so you want to ensure that you know as you're going through that engineering process, that you're meeting all of those incentive requirements, and don't find yourself in a position where at the end of a project, you're expecting to be able to get some payback and you've missed a key component somewhere during the process.
Very helpful, Simon. I'll go to our next question. Any advice on blending the operational management of both new EV fleet and maintaining retiring ICE fleet? Alex, or yes?
Yeah, maybe I'll just jump in there real quick. A couple of things I would say there, and I don't know if that question is towards passenger cars or commercial vehicles, but maybe I'll speak to somewhat of commercial vehicles since it was a fleet question. I would say in every company that you are, if you are currently in the process of transitioning from ICE to electric, and however long that's going to take, keep in mind the employees that you have there, the facility that you have there, transitions as well, right? So I would certainly say, and for us, I can say that from my own experience, we have a lot of mechanics, right? We have 3,500 people worldwide, and a lot of them are mechanics. And they are also in the process of slowly but surely ramping up from being 100% diesel mechanic or natural gas or whatever it may be, to over time be more and more focused on electric. So we certainly are looking internally, how do we get people excited for this new technology? How long does it take to get transition, get them passionate, and essentially start that journey, not only for whoever is responsible for the fleet, but also for everybody else to kind of get on board and get essentially acquainted with this technology.
And I'll add a little bit there just from an infrastructure perspective. Sometimes during that early stage of the transition, there's a tendency to think, well, maybe I can just put the chargers out at the far end of the parking lot, and then we'll work with it later when we get more vehicles. And oftentimes that's a mistake in deployment. It's really important to look at the operational characteristics of the site and think about, okay, how are the vehicles operating? I know I've got 10% electric now and 90% traditional ICE vehicles. Next year I'll be 20/80 and then 30/70 and so on. And so really understanding which routes are you electrifying first? Where do those vehicles typically park in the lot? Do you need to reconfigure that operational characteristics? So it really well thought out strategic planning as you're going through that transition. And you will likely find, as we found in a lot of our deployments, you gain often some operational efficiencies as you're going through this process, because it gives you an opportunity to look at perhaps some things that were going on where you park your trucks or your cars that weren't necessarily operationally efficient, but they just happened that way, and it wasn't something you wanted to change because there was no reason to change it until you're making this transition.
Very helpful. Kind of pulling on some of the comments already made, but I'd be interested, based off of the audience question, like what suggestions would you suggest around kind of future-proofing EVSE equipment, but not oversizing that equipment? Could you speak to that a little bit, Simon? Yeah.
Yeah, I'll jump in on that. So that goes to the comment I made earlier about not thinking about trying to build out the entire EV infrastructure on day one. Really think about building out the infrastructure in phases. We also recommend not necessarily being aligned specifically with a particular charger type or charger brand on day one, but really thinking about the operational needs of the fleet and then finding the equipment that matches those operational needs. And then designing the infrastructure to be as neutral as possible. We all know that this space is evolving, technology is evolving, and equipment that you put in today may not be the same equipment you're operating 5 or 7 years from now. And so designing the infrastructure to be adaptable as technology changes. The other thing that we've discovered in some of the fleets where we've done large scale deployment and they're now reaching that 40 or 50% of the fleet transition period, there's a point in time where you reach an inflection point where likely you will no longer need more infrastructure, but you're still transitioning vehicles. Vehicles begin to get to a point where you're increasing the ratio of vehicles to chargers. So whereas you'll in the initial deployment, you'll likely be in a 1-for-1 ratio of one electric truck or car to one charger. As you get further down the transition, that will become a 2-to-1, a 3-to-1, 4-to-1, whatever is operationally efficient for your fleet. And that allows you to scale that infrastructure appropriately. And again, like I mentioned before, not have stranded capital assets or overbuild the infrastructure. One more comment I'll make there. Oftentimes there's a tendency to say, whether it's range anxiety or charge time anxiety, there's a tendency to say, well, I need a larger charger. I need to go with the 300 kW charger. But when you look at the operational characteristics of the vehicles and the routes they're taking, oftentimes you don't need that it's not that bigger is better approach. Oftentimes you can go with a smaller charger, maybe a blend of smaller, more efficient chargers for the majority of the fleet, with a mix of perhaps a couple of opportunities where you can do faster charging when you've got vehicles that need to turn quickly. But we find that the majority of fleets, the vehicles do have dwell time, whether it's overnight or between shift changes. And the ideal charging time is the ideal charging speed is the one that gets you fully operational without overtaxing the electric system and overtaxing your electric bill.
Thank you, Simon.
If I could tag on maybe from
exactly.
the customer's viewpoint there as well, real quick. Simon talked about future proofing. A lot of people talk about future proofing, right? Which is good. I always say if you dig up concrete, try to only dig it up once, lay some extra concrete and all that stuff. Some extra conduit and all that stuff. But to Simon's point, the future proofing of how much in the future can you use that equipment, don't think that you will never change anything based on your first decision, right? So even your house that you have a lot of love in decorating, you will redecorate every so often. So I would say make sure that you know your information and your fleet and your distances and all that stuff, because if you don't, or you oversize it, like Simon said, you will spend a lot of money that you don't have to spend. So a lot of customer conversations, we go in, they say, oh, every day I drive 500 miles and I have no dwell time and I always weigh out. If that is the case, no problem, we'll design it that way. But most likely that is not true. And you probably spend 50-60% more than what you need to, because you were a little bit too aggressive in your assumptions that you had there. And I would also say, and we talk about incentives a lot, and incentives are certainly necessary, but new technology is expensive, right? Just like your new iPhone every year costs $100 more than you paid the year before. That is also the case with new technology. So don't think that you will save money by going electric. There is certainly a lot of expenses. I would only say try not to paint yourself in a corner. Try to make as few irreversible decisions as possible.
Very good. Thank you, Alex. And I want to be mindful of a couple of minutes remaining before we'll transition to our networking and breakout, but a couple more questions here. Victoria, I'd be interested in your thoughts here. Any advice on integrating sharing infrastructure for both employee EV and fleet EV charging? I liken this to, what we talked about in terms of on-site, at the office charging versus those that might be sales representatives and out in the field. I'd be curious as to your thoughts here.
Yeah, we are using the same engineering design standards and adapting them to be applicable for the country, for someone's home, if they're living in the city versus, in a less urban area. For people who have a personal vehicle, that's technically fleet. We're still looking at this. We haven't solved for it yet, but we're building off the fundamentals of what are our engineering design standards for our charging infrastructure, so that we have a common approach. It's not everybody gets to pick what they want. How do we install it in their house? And if they leave the company, do we even recover that sunk cost? But it also requires, as people put in the chat, both for our employee vehicles, say the charging stations at our parking lots at our facilities, we have to consider the scale of the growth, the projected growth, which has actually gone up significantly more. We're growing EV use by our employees at a much faster rate than we anticipated, which is great. We used originally, as we were designing some of our newer facilities under LEED standards, to put the charging stations in, to put them in at the front of the building. It was our way to encourage people to use EVs because you got preferential parking. Now we can't continue to do that. So we are looking at, there's a question about safety, and I'll kind of comment on that as well. We have the engineering team is looking at where is it safe to put charging stations? What are the options? Do we tear up a parking lot? Do we run lines? Do we have a parking deck that makes it easy? And is it safe to put a charging station in a parking deck, underground? You know, all of these considerations are being built into the design standards for charging stations. The balance is interesting because for us, it's managed differently. We manage our fleet charging just same way we would manage a fleet for ICE vehicles with a fuel card. Basically, it's a procurement card for people to buy their own fuel, and that's how we track fuel use as one of the ways, and costs. How we're going to do that from an EV perspective will be interesting, and assume that's why we're going to pay for chargers. The local or at our facilities is part of our facilities OpEx. That is the electrification of our sites, or the utilities at our sites. And yes, we definitely have to work with our local utilities. And as we're doing our decarbonization strategies at each of our sites, the fleet charging, our vehicle charging has to be considered as part of those upgrades and changes to the site. I will land on something that I would like to hear people talk about in the discussion. It's one of the things we're looking at, and we're early in. I know a lot of companies already do this, but using a solar canopies to drive your charging stations. It's a very interesting, for me not being an engineer, it's a very interesting scenario if it's in the right location and if it's designed correctly.
Very helpful, Victoria, just to understand some of the considerations that you all are kind of working through in the planning stages. And I think that your question there goes nicely with some of the questions that I noticed from the audience as well, of just understanding backup power strategies, battery storage considerations, for instance. Simon, Alex, thoughts there on kind of key considerations to bring in your planning phase?
Yeah, I did see the one question, and you mentioned battery storage. So the one question about resiliency, or what do you do in the event of a power outage? And just a couple of comments with that. Number one is the utility grid is actually very robust, and so when you think about outages, the percentage time is very minimal, but it is a reality and something that you want to think about. What we tend to see is, again, thinking about that transition in a staged capacity, as you're going through 10%, 20%, 30% of your fleet being transitioned, remember that you've still got 70, 80, 90% of your fleet running on traditional fuels. So you've got built-in resiliency right out of the gate from that, to be able to manage a short outage. And then beyond that, as you start to get to that inflection point, whatever that is, whether it's 40% or wherever it is, it's different for every fleet, then you may want to think about what is that backup strategy in the event that you have a power outage. But the idea there is really think about it as an integrated part of your charging infrastructure that can maybe also help you with your power consumption, your demand charges. So that could be some on-site storage that helps manage some of the power spikes, allows you to get more predictable energy usage, but also gives you that resiliency piece in the event that there's a short-term outage.
Very good. Very helpful, Simon. And with that, I see that we're essentially at time. So to close us out here, I'm going to ask the last question is, what's one key takeaway or learning that folks should take to their fleet electrification and infrastructure strategy? And I'll do a quick roundtable, starting off with Alex.
start early, educate yourself, go to events where there's like-minded people, reach out to the suppliers of these technologies, be it charging, be it vehicles, be it other suppliers, and don't be afraid to start on a small scale. You don't need to electrify everything tomorrow. Start small, do your learnings, and you will be much more confident, make better decisions as you go.
Perfect. Thank you, Alex. Victoria?
I think mine would be data, and partner with someone, and I say partner so it's agnostic, on doing a really strong analytical evaluation of your actuals, your projections, and what are the different components that are driving your company strategy and how are decisions being made. So you can format the justification and the sales pitch, if you will, in a correct and really focused way.
Excellent. Thank you, Victoria. Simon?
Start early, find the right partners, both internally and externally, and ask questions. Yeah. Give yourself some grace, because don't expect that you're going to know it all, and don't expect that your partners might know it all. Every fleet is unique. Every vehicle usage and type is unique. And so ask questions. There are no stupid questions. And yeah, give yourself some grace, because you will make mistakes as you go. But if you found the right partners and asked a lot of questions, you can mitigate those mistakes.
Excellent. Thank you so much, Simon. And thank you so much to all of our panelists for a great discussion. And thank you to the audience for joining.